There's much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Ma Tianjie is the Beijing managing editor for China Dialogue, a website focusing on the environment. With us from New Delhi is Arunabha Ghosh. He's the founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Bob Ward is the Policy and Communications Director at London's Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. And Paul Bledsoe served as a climate advisor to US President Bill Clinton. He's currently a strategic advisor for the Progressive Policy Institute right here in Washington, D.C. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Paul, let's start right here in the studio. We look at these rising temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere. We just saw those pictures there of people sweltering in cities in the Northern Hemisphere, record levels of heat. Have we reached a tipping point insofar as the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere?
There's deep concern in the scientific community that that may be happening right now. The truth is, no one really knows. We know this much, that if we continue to increase overall greenhouse gas emissions as we had last year and the year before, for just a few more years, we will miss the opportunity to prevent runaway climate change. What peer-reviewed science says will be a hothouse planet of as much as 7 to 9 degrees Celsius higher temperatures in the next period of a century. We're talking about a planet that is uninhabitable. The good news, we have the technologies to act quickly, but we have to change our politics.
Right.
Your piece set up Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is the most dangerous person on the planet today because of his climate denial. History has shown us that without U.S. leadership, we can't tackle this problem in the global community. I think defeating Donald Trump is the single most important thing to do to prevent a destabilization of the world climate.
And very quickly, Paul, these temperatures that we are seeing in European cities, and in fact that we saw here as well in Washington, how exceptional are they, the rising temperatures?
These are unprecedented temperature increases. More to the point, we now have peer-reviewed science that can connect them, these extreme weather events, extreme heat, but also hurricanes and other extreme weather events, flooding, directly to underlying climate change. A private estimate just last month found that $70 trillion will be the cost to the private economy in this century alone from climate change impacts. This is a massive economic as well as humanitarian issue, and global leaders have got to begin talking about it.
All right, Ma Tianjie, as we heard from our reporter there, one of the goals of the Paris Accords on climate change was to restrict the rise to 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels. Looking at what is happening right now, can that goal be met, do you think?
I think we still have a pathway, and scientists have pointed out that we still have a pathway to control climate warming under 1.5 degrees. But the mitigations, the carbon emission reductions should happen now, as the lead has been saying. And also we need to think of ways to actually suck carbon out of the atmosphere through all kinds of nature-based solutions. So we do still have a pathway if we act right now.
When you say suck oxygen out of the atmosphere, how would that be done?
There are a few techniques which is now called negative emissions techniques. One of the simplest ways is to plant trees that can actually absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store them within the plants. And this is an area where China has been trying very hard and have some success. So this is definitely something I think scientists and policymakers need to consider in the next few years.
Bob Ward, what are your thoughts on these record-breaking temperatures that we are seeing, and what are the immediate effects of these high temperatures?
Well, we've always had heat waves, but it's quite clear that they're becoming more frequent and more intense, and it's undoubtedly due to climate change. We know that the average temperature of the surface of the Earth is rising because of greenhouse gas levels, and that means the extremes of heat are increasing. And in much of the Northern Hemisphere, it's exposing the fact that most of our countries, particularly our cities, are not prepared for these extreme temperatures. We had a heat wave here in the UK a couple of weeks ago, and it's likely that hundreds of people died, mainly in homes that are simply not adapted for the heat and tend to overheat in these temperatures. So it's becoming a public health emergency, these kinds of impacts, because it's not just heat waves. We're seeing an increase in many other types of extreme weather as well, such as heavy rainfall, droughts, and other extreme weather.
And Bob, you know, we saw in our report those pictures of ice melting in Greenland, but what about other effects, like the effect these rising temperatures could have on agriculture, on the crops that we grow? And, you know, that in turn, of course, could threaten our food security, couldn't it?
Well, the main impact is through what it does to rainfall. Some parts of the world are starting to see higher levels of rainfall, but because the atmosphere is warmer, it means it holds more water, and therefore when it rains, it can rain harder, you get more flooding then. But equally, the warmer temperatures mean that it sucks up more moisture, so you get more prone to droughts in some areas, and you see greater risk of wildfire, for instance. Now, this is playing havoc with many crops, and therefore is putting at threat many of the yields we see in parts of the world. We saw a situation in 2010 where a series of weather events led to a shortage of wheat that led to a big spike in the price of bread and other basics. So we know that the world is very vulnerable to the impacts of these kinds of extreme weather events on crops.
All right, let me bring in Arunabha Ghosh. She's in New Delhi. Arunabha, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, India is among countries that is expected to be hardest hit by climate change. In fact, some experts say that even if we implement these cuts in carbon emissions, parts of India could become so hot that it will be inhospitable. It would test the ability of people to be able to survive. How serious is this?
Anand, it's very serious. Say between 2012 and 2016, the average length of a heat wave increased from 2 days to 5 days. And when that occurs again and again over the course of the summer, it just increases the stress both on people, but also on the systems, whether it's public health systems, transportation, and so forth. The way the world is in terms of a high emissions pathway, right now we're looking at well over 3 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels. But if the temperature hits, say, 4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, some of the studies suggest that northern India would have a 30% probability that it would be impossible to do anything outdoors, whether it's recreation or it's economic activity. So the course of this century, and increasingly the nearer term, even the less so, even talking about what's going to happen towards the end of the century, we are looking at a serious problem in terms of heat-related stress, mortality, as well as the economic impact that we're going to face vis-a-vis people not being able to work.
Arunabha, as you point out, if temperatures go as high as 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels or even 4 degrees Celsius, that would have serious consequences. Is there recognition on the part of the Indian government on how serious this is?
There's definitely a multi-party consensus that climate change is something that's hitting us hard and we need to act. 4 years ago, when India put forward its commitments to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, it put forward aggressive plans on renewable energy, on reducing the reducing the emissions intensity of its economic growth, but also building about 2.5 billion tons of carbon sinks in the form of growing forests. But is that going to be enough just for India? Perhaps not, because the world itself is not acting fast enough. And carbon doesn't recognize political borders. So what matters is the amount of carbon that's there in the atmosphere, and what matters is what it's going to do to countries in the tropics in terms of intense heat waves, or impact on precipitation, or impact on agricultural productivity, let alone extreme weather events damaging our coastal infrastructure. So on all of these metrics, we need to build in significant amount of resilience, but also the billions of dollars that we are already spending on adapting to a very hot climate.
And Anand, the truth of the matter is that all major countries' emissions are going up again. After a period in 2014 to 2016 when global emissions were flat, last year Chinese emissions went up nearly 5%. Indian emissions went up over 6%. US emissions, for the first time in almost 20 years under Donald Trump, they went down under Obama, even under Bush, they went up over 2.5%.
Why is that? Why are they going up?
I think that Donald Trump's denial of climate change has left emitters off the hook everywhere around the world.
But it's happening all over the world, you say.
But it's an international community. What Obama did by reaching out to President Xi, who took a very important leadership role, was set the stage for the world's largest economies to commit to decarbonization. And that had an effect globally, not just on other governments, it had a huge effect on private sector investment.
Right.
What we're happening now is there's a vacuum of leadership globally on the issue. This is why I say, without US and Chinese leadership
Well, you say a vacuum in leadership, that's as far as the US government is concerned. What about the US private sector?
The US private sector recognizes these massive risks, but they're also caught up in the Wall Street short-term stock price watching. So it's going to take profound government action.
Okay. Ma Tianjie, what is the situation in China? Why have emission levels been going up there?
Well, China is still very much on track of meeting its commitment to the international community for peaking its carbon emissions before 2030 and probably much earlier. But I think the leadership has to fend off domestic resistance and particularly the pressure on the economy, very much also created by external environments like the trade war that's going on between China and the US. So there are definitely some domestic resistance to some of the pollution control measures that has been going on for the past few years and calls to loosen up some of those measures. But I think the environmental regulators here are very much resisting this kind of pressure and insisting that those pollution measures, which targets actually domestic air pollution, needs to stay in place to maintain decarbonization and a transition to a low-carbon economy.
Bob Ward, the heat wave that hit Europe, as we heard Claire Nillis tell us in that report, it made its way through Spain, through southern Europe, on its way to Greenland, where it's caused some damage. Let's listen to what she had to say about that. Let's watch this.
There has been quite rapid melting of the Greenland ice sheet in recent weeks. In July alone, it lost 160 billion tons of ice through surface melting. That's roughly the equivalent of 64 million Olympic-sized swimming pools.
So, Bob, those are incredible numbers that she was citing there. How consequential will this melting ice be for the planet?
Well, one thing we should note is that the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at the moment is 45% higher than it was in pre-industrial times. The last time it was that high was about 3 million years ago during the Pliocene, and at that time, global temperature was about 3 or 4 degrees warmer than today, and the polar ice caps, including in Greenland, were much smaller, and global sea levels were 10 to 20 meters higher. So we are at risk, as temperatures rise, of crossing some major climate thresholds, particularly the destabilization of the polar ice caps. And indeed, there are some scientists who believe we may already have passed those thresholds for some parts of West Antarctica, where the ice shelf around the ice sheet has started to disintegrate and glaciers are flowing into the ocean inevitably. Now, these sea level rises are not going to happen overnight, but they become irreversible and unstoppable, which locks in a long-term commitment that will threaten coastal communities around the world for many decades and centuries to come. And that's what we're really at stake here. It's not just the impacts today, it's the impacts that we are locking in for our children and grandchildren to have to deal with, and they could be absolutely catastrophic.
Arunabha Ghosh, as you pointed out, if these temperatures rise beyond levels that we can sustain, in parts of the planet. What impact will that have on society if we can't work, if we can't go out in the open? How would people be able to live together? Would there be chaos?
Anand, I think that's the critical part, because it's not just the direct first-order effects of how warm it gets or the impact on food production and things like that. It's actually the systemic effects of how resilient our societies are. When resources are stretched, whether it's water, whether it's coastal degradation, whether it's storm surges, whether it's the impact on the financial system, then what's going to be tested is human interaction. And I'm not sure that we have the governance systems, whether within our countries or between our countries, to manage that kind of stress, whether it's the movement of people, whether it's the impact on the financial system, and so forth. But I just wanted to come in on one point that Paul was making. Mm-hmm. I think it's absolutely imperative that the federal government of the United States acts. And the fact that it's not acting is a big problem. But I don't think climate leadership is only something that rests with the United States or with China. It is everyone's responsibility. Today, India generates more power from renewable energy than the United States does. It already generates more power than the United States from renewable energy. So it's critical that we keep at it in terms of the role that all the major emitters have to play. But it's also critical that the political moment will not come unless we figure out that we have to balance for jobs, growth, and sustainability. It's because we haven't made that political case strongly that we have different lobbyists pushing for one or the other, and we think that these are irreconcilable objectives. They are tough. There will be trade-offs, but we have to try and square this triangle.
It's a great point, and the good news is the technology is so much better than it was even a decade ago. The price of solar around the world has fallen 80%. Yeah. The price of wind, 70%. New electricity storage, which can allow us to use renewable energy all the time. The question is, can we implement these technologies fast enough? Last year in the United States, 70% of all new electricity capacity was zero energy. We have the technology, we need the political will. The final thing I'll say is we've talked all about CO2. CO2 is 60% of global emissions. The other 40% is non-CO2. These include methane, HFCs or hydrofluorocarbons, a super greenhouse gas, black carbon. These are short-lived climate pollutants who are superheating the atmosphere. We need to cut these super pollutants very quickly, or we may not be able to get a hold of near-term global temperatures, because CO2 stays in the atmosphere, at least half of it stays 100 years, 15% stays 1,000 years. So the most single critical need in terms of mitigation actually is methane, black carbon, and HFC.
Right. Paul, I just want to get back to public opinion in the United States. I mean, as you pointed out, to some extent, climate change policies are being held hostage to politics here.
They are.
But if we look at one poll that was done, an Ipsos poll, says that up to 73% of people in the US believe that climate change is real and it's happening right now. That's a jump of 10% from 2015. Why is it out of sync?
There is a nexus between the Republican Party leadership and the fossil fuel companies in the United States, both wanting to take temporary short-term advantage of each other's willingness to deny this problem. It's a very dangerous alliance. I believe it's increasingly being exposed. For example, there are now lawsuits in the United States and all around the world against oil companies over the liability that they hold for long-term climate change impacts. Right. Because studies have shown that the major oil companies have known about these impacts and yet not told their own stockholders and the public. So I think the private sector has got to stop abetting Republican. It's exactly like tobacco. And I think the private sector, the fossil fuel companies, have got to make new investments and stop abetting Republican climate denial.
All right. Ma Tianjie, both China and the United States, both these countries played a leading role in the signing of the Paris Accord. Now with the US pulling out, does that increase the burden on China to lead the world in combating climate change?
I wouldn't call that burden because I think other countries are still very much committed to the Paris Agreement. Recently, we have just seen that 24 European countries have pledged to reach carbon neutrality by mid-century, including the United Kingdom. And China has also signaled to the world that it might also commit to that. The United Nations is going to have a big assembly of world leaders in September next month, and we are expecting world leaders to come to the table with higher ambition and higher commitment on climate actions.
Bob Ward, there's a non-profit organization here in the United States, an organization that works on climate change called Ceres. They say that much is on the line in the next 18 months. Emissions must drop in that period if we are to meet the goals of the Paris Accord. Do you agree with that timeline?
Well, we're certainly at an urgent point. The reason why the next 18 months is particularly important is because we're going to have a crucial summit next year, at the end of next year, the regular annual climate change summit, where countries will be expected to bring forward new reviewed pledges for cutting emissions. They submitted a set of pledges ahead of the Paris Agreement in 2015, and now over the next 18 months they are supposed to be revising them and submitting more ambitious pledges. And we really have to see countries step up now and increase the ambition of what they're pledging to do, but also what they're delivering. The UK here last month set a new target for reaching net zero emissions by 2050. We need more countries to make that commitment and start working towards that, because otherwise, until we cut emissions down to net zero as a world, global temperatures will continue to rise, and we are rapidly getting to the point of no return. This month, July, just gone, was a near record, 1.2 degrees Celsius above its pre-industrial level. Remember that the target that was set in Paris was well below 2 degrees, with best efforts towards 1.5 degrees. So we're rapidly getting close to 1.5 degrees.
Yeah.
Beyond 1.5 degrees, we know that the risks become very big indeed.
Right, and Bob, very quickly, we've just got a little bit of time left. Where does public opinion on this issue lie in Britain? You know, Britain is, of course, committed to the Paris Accords. It's signed that. But is perhaps Brexit taking too much time and energy in Britain?
Brexit's taking too much time and effort in general, detracting from everything. But remember, it was Theresa May's government which put in place this 2050 target. So public opinion is fairly solid around the world. There's almost no country where they aren't in favor of tackling climate change, including in the United States. But really, this is about political leadership. And I think the challenge for countries like the United States, Australia, Canada, and the UK is building a consensus that incorporates those in the center on the right. This cannot be a left-right divide, because even if President Trump doesn't win re-election and we get a Democratic president, if we have a Republican Congress, it will be deadlock and we will see very little progress. So I hope we will see some sensible, moderate Republicans start to come out and say, we accept that climate change is happening, it's driven by humans, and we have to act.
Arunabha Ghosh, I want to address one other issue very quickly. We've just got about a minute left, and that is deforestation and the effect that has on climate change. In fact, there was a very alarming report that came out just in the past week, which said that in Brazil, since President Jair Bolsonaro came to office, the Amazon is being lost at the rate of one Manhattan Island per day. That's the size of the New York Island borough of Manhattan. How much of an impact is this going to have?
This is serious. This is very serious, because it's not just the fact that we lose the forests, so we lose the carbon sink. The forests are also critical towards a larger ecosystem, which is related to the water systems. It's related to soil retention. So when the topsoil, the desertification results in loss of topsoil. That results in loss of soil carbon retention, as well as impacting agricultural productivity. So in fact, India is going to host the next conference of the parties for the UN Convention on Desertification just a month from now.
Right.
And this is going to be a critical issue that we can't just mitigate for climate change just by building solar panels. We've got to preserve our natural ecosystems.
Yeah.
There has been a slight increase in India's forest cover, but we all have to pitch in a lot more towards retaining the natural carbon sinks that we do have.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.